Hey everyone, this is Coach Bean. Just doing a little recap on the American Revolution from early in the year. So, if you remember, the revolution started over taxes on the colonists. The initial tax was the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act initially was a tax on sugar, but was ultimately taxed because colonists were using sugar to not only tax sugar, but they were making rum, they were making molasses, which are all being taxed through this act. So colonists refused to pay the tax. The Parliament rejected and repealed the tax. Then ultimately led to the Quartering Act, which led to what we would know today as our Third Amendment, the ability to house soldiers. The Parliament stated that colonists were going to be forced to pay and feed, house soldiers. There was a lot of resentment towards this. Parliament removed those. Then came the Stamp Act, which you remember was a stamp on paper goods, understanding that plastic was not a staple of society then, so paper goods were used commonly. And you would have to pay a tax on this stamp that would have to be applied to any paper good. Again, colonists, shockingly, refused to pay the tax. Parliament repealed it. Then came the Declaratory Act, which basically was not a tax, but it stated that Parliament had ultimate authority over the colonies because they were their colonies, giving the king ultimate authority over the colonies. Then came, and this is in wrong order, but the Boston Massacre. In all this, remember, 5 citizens in Boston are killed on Liberty Street. If you want to go back, look at the painting or engraving of Paul Revere in the Bloody Massacre. This led to 5 people killed, including Crispus Attucks, the free African American who was killed there, which ultimately led to the Townshend Acts, which is taxes on ultimate amount of goods: paper, duty, lead, oil, paint, tea, which then led to the tea tax as it was repealed. Then came the famous Boston Tea Party, where they threw over $1 million worth of tea into the Boston Harbor, which then led to the Intolerable Coercive Acts. Intolerable is what they were called by the colonists. The Coercive Acts were the penalties to the Bostonians to basically recoup the payments of the lost tea. Remember, the tea that the Parliament was offering was cheaper than tea you could smuggle in. Okay? Now, in all this, you have groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by people like Sam Adams, who were rebellious in these acts, and were stating that they should not be paying these taxes and that they should be thinking of other ways. Remember, it started as more of a kind of small scale, not very violent, not very destructive way. And ultimately, as time grew on, the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party engaged the Sons of Liberty to become much more violent. Okay, you also have literary works like Thomas Paine with the piece Common Sense. Okay, Common Sense, you want to look that up, look at the picture and read some of that. It's the laying the ground of the idea of independence. Okay, then as colonists are starting to kind of prepare for all this, we get to Concord, which is where the weapons that the colonists had been storing in Massachusetts, the local militias. Remember, there's no army. The British find out that there are weapons stored there. General Gage moves towards Concord to try and take the weapons storehouse. Paul Revere famously makes the midnight ride to warn the militias that the British are coming, and that the next morning they meet in Lexington, Massachusetts, where the famous shot heard round the world is fired. We don't know actually who fired the shot, but we know a shot was fired, triggering the start of the Revolutionary War, which leads to the first major battle of Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill is a total disaster for us. We realize we're not really prepared. In this, it's not really our military. It is basically a round of militiamen trying to round up an army against a well-fortified, well-armed, well-trained British army. Okay, so Continental Congress meets for the first time. First time, the Declaration of Rights. The second time, famously, the Declaration of Independence, where we are now stating that we want to be independent of the British rule. In this, you have two groups of people: loyalists, those who are loyal to the royalty, to the British crown. Mainly, some southern states stay loyal, mainly Georgia, but your Massachusetts, your Connecticut's really are more patriotic. They are patriots. They want independence. This is your John Adams, your Ben Franklins, your Sam Adams that are pushing for this idea. Now, in all this, we ultimately choose this famous guy named George Washington, is the nickname Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Okay, Continental Army, if you remember, is this ragtag group that Washington takes full control of. Now, Washington is a wealthy plantation owner from Virginia, but if you remember from earlier, he had fought in the French and Indian War under British rule. He was a British general and was an ultimate failure. Okay, the British somewhat laugh at the fact that we were picking a guy like George Washington to be in charge of our army. Which leads to some of the famous battles. The Battle of Trenton, Battle of Princeton, which is where Trenton is where he crosses the Delaware River in the middle of the night before Christmas, the icy Delaware. Wins at the Battle of Trenton, killing the Hessian army. Leads to the Battle of Princeton, literally on the grounds of Princeton University. Kings Mountain, which is across the Appalachians, where we have Tennesseans like John Sevier crush and destroy the British Army. Saratoga is the famous turning point of the Revolutionary War, where we take the offensive. We go and actually begin targeting officers and begin shooting at the generals and officers of the British Army, which are totally against the rules of war in 1700 warfare. But we're fighting for something bigger than a war. We're fighting for the right to form our own country. And then the famous final battle is Yorktown. Yorktown is where, in Virginia, where we basically surround the British Army in the southern support in Virginia. We take control, we take their final readouts and turn the cannons against them, take them, capture the biggest British army that they have, and ultimately are going to lead to the victory of the war. Now, all those are victories that we're mentioning as battles, but we don't mention famous events like Valley Forge, where we lose more soldiers at Valley Forge than almost any battle in the entire war. And it's not through battle, but it's through the remnants and the fight of a winter in the cold Pennsylvania hills of soldiers freezing to death and lack of food, lack of malnutrition, or not lack of malnutrition, but actual malnutrition, to where soldiers are dying under our own watch. And that's where Washington famously inoculates soldiers, because they have an outbreak of smallpox, to try to stop the epidemic that is spreading throughout his camp. And that works, and they begin to train the soldiers throughout the middle of the war into fighting in a more guerrilla-style fighting. Okay? And then after the war, we get to the Treaty of Ghent, which is that we meet in Belgium with Britain. And in this, it takes 2 or 3 years for Britain to finally admit that they have lost the war. In this, Britain realizes we have to recognize American independence. We have to allow us as a country to set our own borders, which will go to the Mississippi River. Even though the colonies stop at the Appalachians, we now have land all the way to the Mississippi River. And in this, Britain is also recognizing the fact that we have full entitlement to the lands, and that they are now banished from this area, other than in Canada, where they will remain, as we'll get to later on, with 1812, when we have more conflict. But in this, it is the greatest victory in our history to actually form our own country, with the famous Declaring of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, edited and helped through with John Adams, Ben Franklin, who help in making sure we state that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Look into the assignments as we review through this stuff that we covered early in the year. Stay safe.